Okay, let's get back into our training. Again, hope everyone had a good lunch. So we're going to go to module 2 and talk about the cultural competence continuum. Okay, let's get back into our training. Again, hope everyone had a good lunch. So we're going to go to all right, got rid of that. All right. Get to our screen share. Okay, cultural competence continuum, becoming culturally competent. So we've been talking about that throughout the morning. We start with cultural destructiveness, and that we saw a good demonstration of in the video, where the receptionist was just oblivious to the needs of the client and the cultural differences between her culture and the client, the patient's culture. And it was destructive in that it discouraged the young woman from seeking continual health care for herself and her unborn child. And so then incapacity, when we talked about cultural destructiveness, and now looking at moving a little bit further along at cultural incapacity, where we see, at least with cultural incapacity, we see the need for cultural competency and realize that we do not have the capacity. We have not accessed the resources and the readiness to have the capacity to be culturally competent. So on this slide, you see some definitions. Developing cultural competence is an evolving, again, it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen overnight. It evolves over time. And so it's an evolving dynamic process that takes time and occurs on a continuum. And that's what we're looking at, the continuum. So we start with the cultural destructiveness, and that's where attitudes and practices, as well as policies and structures in organizations are destructive to a cultural group. And then we move on to cultural incapacity, and we see that ultimately we're headed towards cultural proficiency. So cultural incapacity is the capacity to respond effectively to the needs, interests, and preferences of culturally and linguistically diverse groups. And so we see that it's lacking. This capacity is lacking, and that's an awareness. That's a good place to be for a young organization, or even a therapist who is just realizing that there needs to be a greater level of competence culturally, to be aware that they don't have the capacity to respond effectively to the needs, interests, and preferences of culturally and linguistically diverse groups. Cultural blindness is another place of awareness, and we see that in the next phase, or the next step of the continuum. Cultural blindness, and cultural blindness is the predominant philosophy, is one that views and treats all people the same. And we can easily be caught up in that because we want to be fair. We want to be fair to everybody. However, what's fair to one culture is not necessarily considered fair to another. And so after cultural blindness, realizing that everything that we feel is fair is not necessarily fair to every culture, Then we come to a place of cultural, becoming culturally pre-competence. And that's, we're not at a place of competence just yet, but we're striving toward that place. We're striving toward becoming culturally sensitive. And so cultural pre-competence is an awareness of strengths and areas that where growth is needed. So we'll move from pre-competence to competence. But when we think about even the stages of change and being pre-contemplative, is a place of kind of awareness that becoming contemplative is necessary, but not necessarily ready to take that step yet. Pre-competence is where there is an awareness, but you begin to look at strengths and areas for that where growth is needed to respond effectively to culturally and linguistically diverse populations. And so looking at cultural pre-competence, you know, we have to look at our prism and how we see things and our view. What are we viewing others' cultures through? We're viewing it through our own culture or our own prism or our own filter. And so in order to differentiate, we have to get our culture and our beliefs set to a side so that we can see the culture of others clearly and not in comparison to ours, but as a culture in and of itself, not a culture that, not something that's adverse or different from our culture in a negative way, but that it is a culture in and of itself and needs to be embraced. So here we are moving toward cultural competence. And cultural competence is the acceptance and respect for culture, and is consistently demonstrated in policies, structures, practices, and attitudes. So for us individually, as individual therapists, individual providers, it's in practice and attitudes, but as the agency being culturally competent as a whole, it's in policies and structures. And finally, we look at the final step is cultural proficiency. And cultural proficiency is where culture is held in high esteem and used as a foundation to guide all endeavors. And so we're putting cultural proficiency, we're putting the culture of those that we work with first and foremost in understanding. And sometimes it's necessary to have a conversation with our clients regarding their culture and the policies and procedures and structures of our agency, as we talked about earlier. And Patrick touched on this. We may have to have a conversation about gift giving, because we may have to get them to a place of understanding that though we appreciate your intention, and but our agency does not allow gift giving, because we can't break away from policies and structures, practices or attitudes for the sake of upholding culture if it will be in violation to what we need to adhere to, not only for our agency, but to comply with other certifications that the agency must uphold. Do y'all get what I'm saying? So there needs to be some delicate conversation about the culture, if indeed their cultural practices would be contrary to our policies. Now, if we can adjust our policies and our structures and our practices to accommodate the culture without it being harmful or unethical, then that's a different story. But if what they feel is culturally, what's culturally uncomfortable for them, if what will make them culturally comfortable is unethical, or dangerous, then we have to have a conversation, and we want to do it with as much kindness as we possibly can. But nevertheless, the understanding must take place. And some other cultural norms, some things that may be normal for one culture, say the drug culture, would not be suitable for the treatment culture. And so some conversation has to take place, because though it may not involve the direct use of drugs, it may be behaviors that would cause triggers for other clients. And even for that client, be a setup for a relapse, certain behaviors, certain attitudes, even though the actual drug use is not part of that drug culture that they're emulating in the treatment culture. Any comments? So in looking at our prism, as we look at and moving along the continuum, and we look at the restructuring of our prism so that we can become more culturally competent, we want to look at life situations, those life situations that have constructed our prism, that have given us the picture through which we see life. And then we meet these clients who are different, from a different culture than ours, and we're still looking at them through the same prism, and or the same view, or the same filter as we see life, and that can cause friction in the therapeutic relationship. A prism is it's almost like a filter. What passes through it is changed or refracted as a result of going through our prism. So what they present with, when we pass it through our prism of how we see ourselves, others, the world, and the future, we refract their reality and see it through our own eyes, and we may be seeing it different than it actually is. When something is refracted, it's the direction of it is changed, or the angle by what it passes through, the is changed by the direction or angle by what it passes through. So we allow their situation to pass through our beliefs and our past experiences, again, maybe changing their reality. So what we want to do, again, is to set aside, to become more culturally competent. We want to set aside our beliefs. And I like the example Mary gave about seeing that picture through her upbringing and living with her mother, who would not tolerate anything being out of place. Everything had a place and everything was intact. And that's how she adapted to that, and she lives by that. And so in passing that woman's life with all the children and the cereal, and hanging from the chandelier, standing on the countertop, just was so much. She did have the baby in her arms, though, for safety. So she was protecting the little one. But, in seeing that and passing it through the prism of everything has its place and everything needs to be in order, and anything outside of that prism is just wrong. If we saw it that way, it would affect not only our view of ourselves saying, what am I going to do to fix this? I got to fix this situation. how she would view others, that being the mother, that being the children and their safety or lack thereof, her view of the world around, that the world should be intact. And if things are not set, place, and intact, it may cause a great deal of anxiety and then affecting that woman's future, as we talked about, possibly having her children taken for a reason that maybe could have been handled in another way. Any comments on this? Talk back to me. Joanna, any comments on the restructuring of our PRISM?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. It's interesting all that we're talking about, because I lived in Cambodia for 7 years. And so some of it's even restructuring for me coming back into the United States. So wow. Just kind of seeing how, the world is different even on this side of the world. And so, but I mean, a lot of this makes sense and helps me to recognize, when I'm working with people from different cultures, a lot of what I experienced when I was overseas and had to kind of restructure over there too, to understand the culture in which I was living in. So, I mean, wow. For me, I feel like it resonates with all of, what I'm doing here on this side of the world and, kind of my own restructuring, I guess.
That's good. That's really good, because when we talk about our daily interaction with our clients, it cannot be driven by our beliefs. And so we have to go back and start at this situation right here. And I'm sure when you went to Cambodia, their life circumstances did not line up with your life experiences.
Right.
And so you have to revisit the beliefs that were developed as a result of what we encountered that formed our prism. There are times when you need to clean your filter. You need to clean your filter. If you're like me and you fry food, you may use the same grease more than once. If you do, you have to have a strainer to get the particles out of the grease, the oil, to use it again. My grandmother, when I was a little girl, she had 2 strainers and 2 Crisco cans. I don't know, some of y'all might not be old enough to remember when Crisco cans were actually metal cans, mm-hmm. and they didn't melt. And she would keep her oil from, say she fried fish, she would keep her fish oil in one Crisco can, and it had its own strainer. And she would keep her chicken oil in another Crisco can, and it had its own strainer. So when I learned to wash dishes, my grandmother said, listen, girl, don't get my strainers mixed up, because you'll have my chicken grease smelling like fish. And so I learned, that came back to me as I began to study about our belief systems and how we filter experiences through, our experiences are filtered through our life history. And sometimes it can come out smelling kind of fishy. Mm-hmm. And so, I look at that when dealing with clients and being culturally competent. I have to look at my beliefs and look at whether they're faulty or not. Even if they're not faulty, they're substantial for me, but they may not be for my client, depending on their culture.
Right. Yep.
Did anybody bring Play-Doh? I put it in the email, but it was kind of late, so I didn't know if you guys were actually going to be able to get it. Did anybody bring Play-Doh?
No, I couldn't find it.
I have some. I just would have to go grab it. I forgot to grab it.
Who's that?
Nikel.
Okay, Nikel, would you grab it? And yeah. Anyone else?
As far as tomato, or still talk on we're talking about.
the Play-Doh, but you can still make a comment if you like.
Yeah, I just wanted to, this premise that we're talking about kind of makes me remember I lived in Germany for 4 years.
Wow.
And just to understand this word premise, it's, to
Prism.
me, it's like
Prism.
prism. Is that
Prism.
prism?
Yeah.
It's like seeing the world according to my ideas. Would that be a
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
statement? Okay, yeah. So when I lived in Germany, I didn't know anything about this word, but thinking about it now, they live completely different from the way we Americans live.
Yeah.
And they did a lot of things that to me were strange, but it was normal and comfortable for them. And so
Okay.
me trying to fit into their structure was very hard. And so I didn't, I didn't meet a lot of people on a personal level because I just didn't understand a lot of their ways, But that's what that word kind of, I just want to make sure I had this right response to that word. It's like, looking at the world as far as how I see it, and counseling, and that's not always good.
Absolutely. And I'm telling you, a good example is the one you gave about your upbringing and how you saw that woman's house based on what you experienced growing up and how you were raised.
Yeah, because that we're just looking at that picture kind of made me crazy,
Yeah,
like, oh
right.
God.
Right. And so
and that's not a good thing. It really isn't a good thing on my end, because that's a lot of anxiety.
Yeah.
And I still find myself, going through that today, walking in my house and seeing everything disorganized. I just go bonkers.
Yeah. And it puts stress on your body. It does damage to you. The people who are causing the chaos are not as bothered by it.
They fine.
They fine. Absolutely. Absolutely. Nikhil, did you get back?
Yes, I'm here. I have it right here.
Okay, I want you to make something out of it that has meaning to you. And when I come back to you, I don't want you to tell us what it is. I want you to just show it to us on the camera.
No.
Okay.
Okay. And so we'll get back to that. Let me know when you're done.
Okay.
So tips for service providers, communication. We want to be understanding. We want to demonstrate feelings. Understanding is a feelings-oriented response, and it conveys sensitivity and support. And remember, we're developing rapport, and we don't always have a great deal of time to develop rapport. Often we don't have our clients for that long, so we need to develop rapport as quickly as possible to move forward for the best outcome as possible for the client and for the therapeutic relationship. And so we want to demonstrate sensitivity to their culture. We want to be sensitive. We want them to know we're interested in their culture. Clarification. This shows interest in getting the right perception. And so if I don't understand, and I'm gonna go back to the example given by Patrick, chipping. If I don't understand chipping, I can pretend and ignore it and let the conversation continue. Patrick, what exactly was it that they told you chipping was?
Chipping is you're using a little bit every other day.
Okay. So go ahead.
And I did exactly what you were just saying. I pretended as if I knew what they were saying. And that particular word came up in a few other sessions with other clients. So I said, I'm not going to keep pretending because I'm creating a treatment plan. I'm making notes. I need to find out exactly what my clients are saying to me and stop pretending like I know what they're saying. And I asked, and it was explained to me. So now I know, because they use
So
that word quite often.
it would
It's
now not knowing and not getting clarification up to the point that you did get clarification, but that period of time of not knowing, and first of all, they're looking at each other and they're saying, I guess chipping is okay, since Patrick didn't check us on it, and so it is so important to get clarification, because they're talking about chipping and they're admitting to using every other day in small amounts, such as it is, because I don't even know how addicts use in small amounts, but that I was not that kind of substance abuser. So, but here clarity was imperative to their treatment experience. And so we have understanding, we have clarification, and then self-disclosure. Self-disclosure or internal reflection is can be a very vital piece to developing the rapport. Everybody is not comfortable with self-disclosure. All therapists are not comfortable with self-disclosure. I am. But even when we are comfortable with disclosing our own history that the client may be able to relate to, we want to be careful of a couple of things. We want to make sure we share mountaintop experiences and not share, self-disclose about something where we're in the valley with it currently. And we want to limit our sharing time frame wise, so that the session doesn't become about us, but it remains the client session. But it is very powerful in communication and developing rapport. Our speech and our body language should reflect acceptance and respect. And I remember early on in my career learning that we shouldn't fold our arms when we're listening or cross our legs. But I have since realized that it depends on what else goes with your folded arms that will determine whether it is a open communication or a closed communication. Because if you got your arms folded and you've got a stern look on your face, like you shut down, then that's negative. But if you fold your arms and you lean forward and you're nodding and you are engaging, then you are encouraging communication. So, but we want to pay attention to our speech and our body language, and it should reflect acceptance and respect. And then be aware of your own belief, points of reference, biases, and worldview. And then encourage hope and recovery in our communication. As we communicate, we want to make sure what we communicate encourages hope and recovery. So how would you encourage hope and recovery? Patrick, I'm picking with you. How would you encourage hope and recovery once you got the clarification about chipping?
Well, once I got that information, I tried to encourage the client that, okay, well, at least you're not using every day. You're not using every day, and let's try to, if you're only using once or twice a week, let's try to minimize it to maybe once a week. And talk to them where do they want to see themselves go with the continued use or, gradual decrease in using the drug and being treated with methadone.
Okay.
So that's where I was going. That, okay, you're not using every day, that's good.
Okay. So you encouraged hope, and then you gave a glimpse of what recovery would look like if they continued to cut back until finally they were not using anymore.
Right.
Did you give them any type of warning in terms of the disease of addiction and how that chipping could backfire on them?
Once I clearly understood, understood what chipping meant. I explained that now you're feeding this desire, and the more you do that, the more you're going to want to use more. And they understood that process because that's where they have been using every day, no matter what the situation was, and getting treated for methadone, with the methadone, I should say.
So that could, okay.
So yeah, I told them, you at some point you're going to be in total relapse.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And telling the truth, and giving them the facts, but doing it to encourage hope and recovery is a skill. It's a skill, because you don't want that attitude of rebellion and resistance to rise. We want the client to understand we're on their side, even when we have to give them that talk. We want them to know that we're on their side. Patrick, did you raise your hand?
Yes, I did. I also wanted to add that when I let clients know that I don't know everything and that they're in a position where they can educate me, I think they appreciate that.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes, I think some of their experiences, and again, I'm just guessing based on some of the things they've shared with me and their expressions, but I think they come in and they sit across the desk or whatever from the therapist, counselor, whomever, and they're kind of talked down to or treated as if the counselor or therapist is better than. And so when they have an opportunity to educate and use some of their street knowledge or whatever with a person in my position or in our position, they really appreciate that.
Okay.
Because I tell them, now you're building on one of your strengths.
Yeah.
Because you have strengths.
Yes.
And that also is helpful to many of them because they feel like, oh, okay, yeah, I have something to share. I have something to give back. Yeah, you do.
And so when we talk about resources and readiness equal capacity, we're talking about their inner resources as well, not just the resources of the agency. And that's a real good point. Not just the resources of the agency, not just the resources of the therapist, but the internal resources of the client and their stage of change or their readiness to utilize those internal resources. They must first be made aware that they have them. And what better way but to allow them to teach us and educate us to help us understand their culture. Tassie, your hand is up. Thank you, Patrick.
One of the things that I've always done when working with my substance use patients is I just tell them very directly, you're the expert in your life. So anything that you can teach me, I'm willing to learn and want to learn. So when I've been talking to them and they say something like, I had a tray 5, and I'm like, what's a tray 5? And they're willing to tell me. Right now, I can't even think of what it is off the top of my head, but it's definitely one of those substance use terms, and they've changed over time so much.
Yeah.
When I initially started, they would say, I use dope. And of course, to me, that meant weed. Because that's what it was. Come to find out, like 4 weeks later, that actually meant anything but weed. Like meth, heroin, they just said, I smoke dope. And I'm like, oh, so you smoke weed. That wasn't the case. So I got educated on that real quick.
Okay.
But I think just having them be able to tell me this is what it's like, and I'm able to say, thank you for teaching me something, that gives them that little bit of hope that, hey, I do have value. I do have worth, even if it is just educating in my life and my struggles. To them, that's important, because then I in turn can say, I'm really proud of you for being able to share that with me. And then that kind of puts that little tiny light of hope at the end of the tunnel for them. And it also is getting them more willing to share more personal things with me as it goes.
Okay, absolutely, absolutely. And so I'm telling you, it's an education. You know, we bring to the table what we have, and the clients can just give us a world view, you know, a cultural view that is amazing. Yes. So now, let me see. Okay, Nikhil, I'm almost ready for you.
Okay.
Give me 1 second here. I want to look at this video before we do our Play-Doh exercise. So let's go to the video. And we still want you to keep in mind how you see things and whether or not you see through your prism, the prism that you have, or are you willing to cleanse it, clean it out, and set it aside so you can see what's going on with your client. Cultural stereotyping.
Hello.
Hi, Mr. Surumura.
Yeah, that's me.
Hi, I'm Jen. I'm your in-home occupational therapist from Smith Rehabilitation.
Okay. Yeah, hey, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Here, come.
Uh-oh. I'm sorry.
Hello.
Hi, Mr. Surumura.
Yeah, that's me.
Hi, I'm Jen. I'm your in-home occupational therapist from Smith Rehabilitation.
Okay. Yeah, hey, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Here, come on in.
So, how are you doing today, Mr. Samura?
I'm actually doing pretty well, thanks.
Good.
You know, I hate to mention it, but it's actually pronounced Tsuyemura. But, you know, you could just call me Jay.
I'm so sorry. I have a really hard time pronouncing Chinese names.
Yeah.
I apologize.
It's okay. So yeah, what are we doing?
Yeah, so I spoke with Karen at the Rehabilitation Center, and we decided that today would just be a simple assessment, should only take about 20 minutes. But first off, do you mind if I do a quick safety check, walk around?
Yeah, sure, that's fine, go ahead.
Thanks. I love all the Chinese artwork you have in here. I just think Chinese people are so creative.
Yeah, you know, that's all Japanese artwork. You know, from my family, handed down over the years.
Oh, nice. Yeah, so I was thinking maybe we could do some fun activities these next couple of weeks, maybe some kung fu warm-ups, maybe a functional activity like cooking General Tso's chicken. What do you think about that?
Listen, those just aren't really anything that I'm interested in. I mean, you keep saying China this and Chinese that, Kung Fu and like General Tso's. but not all Asian people are Chinese. I'm Japanese, right?
I'm really sorry, Mr. Suyamura. I didn't mean any disrespect. I don't have a lot of experience.
I mean, it's okay, Jen. A lot of people make the same mistake, but I mean, it's like Latin cultures, right? There's a lot of different ethnicities within Latin cultures, and they're each really pretty unique.
I apologize.
It's fine. Don't worry about it.
Well, should we move on with the assessment in the kitchen?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so let's talk about it. What went wrong in this scene and why was the client irritated?
First for me, it was really, I hate to say the word painful, but it was painful to watch because it was just, I think just the assumptions that going in, she said she was doing a safety check. And for me, it was like, you didn't even do a safety check. You just made comments about what you thought were appropriate things to say. And even after he kind of corrected her in a very polite way, she continued to kind of go down that path and not do what she needed to do for her occupational therapy safety check.
Okay.
And I think that's one of the things that kind of got under my skin, because it's like, really? And I think that would have been one of the biggest reasons for irritation, because it was just not being sensitive to what he was saying. She didn't hear him when he was speaking to her.
Yeah, it was painful. He handled it well. That might not always be the case. Any other comments? Latasha? John? Taylor? Anybody? Joanna?
Yeah, I'll comment. Yeah, I think she was closed off like right from the beginning. She came in and started, I mean, every typical stereotype that you could pop out, she just started, and she didn't adjust until about 3/4 of the way through it. And it was nice that she was empathetic and apologized. However, that it was already, the door was already closed at that point in time.
Yeah.
So I think that's the thing that you got to be receptive of, is that I think the observation that I made immediately was when she came to the door looking down and seeing the shoes there, being courteous of just knowing that that's a cultural thing. And when you recognize that, acknowledge it and at least make an effort in that end of it. And that will set the stage and going the rest of the way, so that was just my observation.
Yeah. Yeah. I, as a kid growing up, I grew up with Japanese neighbors, and there was a Japanese family across the hall in the apartment we lived in, and a Japanese family below us. And that's one of the things that I thought was so cool about their culture, is that we had to take our shoes off when we went to visit. And, I got to take my shoes off and run around barefooted. But how many of us actually recognize the difference between Asian cultures? If we don't study it, how will we know? You know what I'm saying? If we don't take the time to study it, how will we know that taking the shoes off is not customary for Chinese as well as Japanese, or even other ethnicities? Do we look at them? I've heard people say that we all look alike, which is so far from the truth. But do we look at Asians and think they all look alike? Or do we confuse Vietnamese with Chinese. So if we don't ask and if we don't get the education from the client, how will we know? She should have done her homework before she even got there.
Right.
Okay, so that being said, Nicole, I'm ready.
Okay, I'll try to get my camera aimed at it. Don't set your expectations too high.
Okay, so we're going to look at her creation and you're going to write in the chat what you think it is. Nicole, don't agree or disagree. Just let them write in the chat what they think your creation is.
Okay, and it was something that was important to me, correct?
Yes.
Oops, it's upside down. Let's see.
Okay. All right, so are we ready? I'm gonna put in what I think it is.
Okay, has everybody seen it?
Okay. I only have 4 responses. I need everyone to put in the chat what you think Nicole's response is. Nicole, can you show it again?
Sure.
Carolyn?
Okay, I'm doing it. Okay, where's my chat go? My chat disappeared. Oh, here it is.
Let's see, I think I need Carolyn, John. I got you, John.
My chat.
Patrick, I got you. Did I get Taylor? Yep, I got Taylor. Ariel, I got Ariel. Okay, I think what's that? Mary. Mary, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm writing.
Okay. Okay.
Start it over now. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah.
It's okay. We're waiting on you.
Okay.
You want me to put it in for you? Tell me what it is.
Different cultural backgrounds of people getting along. I know that I was trying to narrow it down to different cultures of people getting along.
Okay. All right. Nicole, tell us what it is.
Okay, so several of you nailed it. The first thing I thought of was my family, but they kind of look like seals, so I'm glad no one said seals.
Okay, so it's family.
Yes.
All right, now, so we know what we pretty much was what we were able to guess what Nicole made, but we don't know why that's important to Nicole. And the only way we'll know is to ask. And so if you would like to disclose to us why you chose family, you can.
Yeah, everything that I do revolves around them. Like I have 4 children, so we're constantly doing things for them, their events, every decision I make. I'm in recovery, so I got sober for myself, but for them too. So they're just super important people.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And so you see, we don't want to pry, but we want to engage so that we get to know the why of some things. So I have one. Get ready to go back to your chat.
Okay.
You got some thank yous in the chat, Nikhil.
Yes, you're welcome.
Okay.
Thanks for-
Can you see mine?
Yeah,
I can't figure out what
pull
it
it
is.
back a little. Can you pull it back a little? Okay. Hmm. What is it?
I'm not a sculptor.
Hmm.
A thought bubble, a starfish. Okay. Let's see. Oh, okay. An organ, a leaf, a sea creature. Okay. Sunshine. All right. All right. It's a brain.
Oh, okay.
It's a brain. And so, anybody want to take a stab at why I may have made a brain?
Well, I just
Not you, Mary. Not you. Because I think you know. So, no. Anybody? Latasha?
Is it because I mean you need your brain in a general sense, like in order to function, you need your brain. And yeah, I don't know. That's the farthest I got.
Okay. All right. Anybody else want to take a stab at it?
Would it be because you're thinking of different ideas and you're always thinking of different things to do all the time, that you never at rest, that your brain is constantly going, thinking of things that you can do better?
You talking about my brain personally?
Personal, yes.
Okay. All right. One more person. You want to take a stab at why I made a brain?
I thought maybe you made a brain because you wanted to show how drugs affects the area of the brain.
That's the
because
answer I expected. Yeah.
Because you had writing on, I couldn't see the writing. Maybe you pointed out the medulla and cerebral and all those areas of the brain that maybe drugs may impair.
Okay. Now, and so what happens with our clients is that we tend to guess, we assume, and it may be because, like, what you all said, what Latasha said is true to all people. We need our brain. What Carolyn and Patrick said concerning the brain, kind of because you know who I am and you know a little bit about me. So, now Mary, what were you going to say? Mary Lewis?
gotta unmute myself. Okay. I was going to say that it could have been because for the last few years, you have been studying the brain and how it's been affected by drugs and alcohol, and you know kind of where that took you and how you got your good brain back. You know. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let me tell y'all a story. And let me tell y'all why I did the brain. My youngest son had brain surgery Friday. And he is doing exceptionally well, exceptionally well. And that's the first thing that came to me. That was the first thing that came to me was how blessed we are that he's doing so well. He has had a brain tumor for the last 6 years, and it was inoperable. And a new surgery through laser has made it possible to go to the core and shrink the tumor, even though they can't fully remove it, to give some relief off of his brain in hopes of helping him with seizures. And so that's why I chose the brain. But if you didn't talk to me, because certainly this does not look like a brain, but if you didn't talk to me, you wouldn't know. And so we want to be sensitive and not put all our clients in the same category, because it's a common thing that happens to us when we approach burnout. And we're going to talk about burnout in just a little bit. I used Play-Doh a lot when I was doing face-to-face therapy. I used Play-Doh a lot. Because it's very therapeutic and it gives people a chance to express themselves. So let's jump back to our PowerPoint. Cultural differences in communication. We want to avoid assuming that a client has a particular expectation or expression of nonverbal or verbal communication based solely on race, ethnicity, or cultural heritage. For example, a counselor could make an assumption during an interview that a Native American client prefers non-directive counseling style coupled with long periods of silence. However, the client expects a more direct, active, goal-oriented approach. So we want to be knowledgeable and remain open to differences in communication patterns that can be present when counseling others from diverse backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
Examples of general differences among cultural groups. So these are some general differences among cultural groups, but it's not written in stone. And that's what we have to remember. There are people who may be European or white European who were raised in a Black community. I remember working at a treatment facility, and most of the white women that were there came from a particular area in Detroit called Brightmoor, and they hung out with African Americans. And so a lot of what we would assume to be a cultural norm, perhaps for white Europeans, they didn't ascribe to, because they were young, and for a great deal of their young lives, they had adapted to African American norms. And so none of this is written in stone. That's why we have to communicate with our clients to find out what their cultural preferences are. So individuals from many white European cultural groups can be uncomfortable with extended silences and can believe them to indicate that nothing is being accomplished. That's from a study. Another study shows that Native Americans, who often place great emphasis on the value of listening, can find extended silence appropriate for gathering thoughts or showing that they are open to another's words. And so it's kind of like when you're trying to figure out what somebody's love language is. You watch them, you interact with them, and you watch their responses. Another study says that Latinos often value warm, genuine communication in interpersonal relationships and value personal rapport in business dealings. They prefer personal relationships to formal ones. Here's some more examples. Another study shows that many Latinos also initially engage in small talk to evaluate the relationship. And they often use this small talk prior to disclosing more personal information. So that small talk helps them determine whether or not they want to move forward in more self-disclosure. Asian Americans can be put off by a communication style that's too personal, emotional, and some may lack confidence in a professional whose communication style is too personal. And we, as Americans, can be pretty personal. So that's something that we would want to pay attention to. And then, so we looked at these first two. Let's see, some cultural groups are more comfortable with a high degree of verbal confrontation and argument. I think about back in the 80s, people who I know who went through, and even some in the 90s, who went through treatment at a particular treatment center. And when they talked to me about the confrontation that this treatment center presented, I'm like, that would not have been comfortable for me. I don't know if I would have been able to get my recovery through that type of confrontation and argumentative treatment style. And then others emphasize balance and harmony in relationships and shun confrontation. So we want to pay attention to that. And we can even ask, some people know what they like and what they don't like. Some don't know until it's presented, and then they get that check and they back up from it. But some of our clients will know what their preferences are. When we talk about SNAP, strengths, needs, what is it? SNA, strengths, needs, something, and preferences.
Abilities.
Thank you, Joanna. And so we want to know what their strengths are, those internal resources. We want to know what they need. What are you coming for? What do you want to get? What is your best hope for your counseling sessions? And then abilities. What are your abilities that you bring to the table? And they may know and they may not. And what are your preferences? What do you prefer in treatment? Do you prefer group to individual? Do you prefer individual to group? Do you prefer to talk and just be listened to for the most part? Do you want to be educated? Do you want your therapist to give you a great deal of insight and conversation? Those are some things that will help get us off to a really good start culturally with our clients. In Module 3, clinicians must be sensitive, understanding, culturally aware, and non-judgmental to cultural components and stressors that exacerbate the likelihood of substance abuse. So as counselors, we're faced with clients experiencing new sets of difficulties that are associated with substance abuse and cultural stressors and concerns due to two factors. One, countless new substances are reaching neighborhoods in the United States each year. And somebody touched on how rapidly things change in the drug culture, the language, the drugs that are being used. And then new people from different parts of the world enter the United States as well. And so they come with their own set of presenting problems, and then combined with being in the drug culture in the United States. So stressors for both adults and adolescents lend heavily to drug and alcohol use and abuse. So we want to pay close attention to and be sensitive to. Again, we don't want to deal with so many people and not take care of ourselves with self-care that we are no longer sensitive, understanding, and willing to become culturally aware. And we have to certainly watch for being judgmental. So the drug culture, understanding the role drug cultures play in clients' lives is important because these cultures influence substance use and abuse and the behaviors in which they engage to manage mental disorders. Drug cultures differ according to the substances used. And so you're talking about, on the one hand, with opioid users, you're talking about chipping, where when you said chipping, Patrick, my mind went, because I was not an opioid user. I was a crack cocaine user. So when you talk about chipping, my mind went to a whole different place, because you know, what'd you say?
I just said nothing. I just said, okay.
Because when you talk about chipping as a crack cocaine addict, what that meant, that could mean a couple of things. One, trying to preserve what little bit we had, and so we was just trying to do a little bit, a chip at a time instead of a whole boulder. The other thing is going to buy drugs for other people with their money and chipping off of it before we gave it. So, the different substances,
Right.
may have the same word that means something totally different.
Totally different. Right.
Yeah. Geographic locations, the drug culture differs in geographical locations and socioeconomic statuses as well. When I started using drugs, I was a homeowner. I worked for General Motors. My husband worked for General Motors. We both started using powder cocaine, and we hung out with people who had good jobs and nice cars and nice homes, and so did we. And we got high with those people. And we were of a different economic status at that time. Needless to say, over the years of using, I used up approximately 10 years. There was a great deal of loss of jobs, loss of houses, loss of cars, geographical change. And then crack came along to exacerbate that downward spiral, and put us in a whole nother category, a whole nother status. And so those are some of the things, that are important. I adjusted when I came into recovery. I came into a 12-step program that helped me to get some acceptance from regarding where I started and where I ended up. But my husband, who I was separated from at that time, did not go through a 12-step program. We eventually divorced, and he remarried, and his wife told me that he couldn't get past wanting to be back at that socioeconomic status that he remembered, that he was proud of himself of, that he once had before the drugs. And it was unrealistic. So much had changed. I mean, plants had shut down. He had sold his seniority. The automotive industry was plummeting, and it was just simply unrealistic to expect to get back to that place, coming out of a crack cocaine addiction and having 10 years go by. And so those are some things that we want to consider too in dealing with our clients, is what culture or what is their status now, what drug culture, where did this take them, and how do they feel about it compared to where they may have once been. So what can we do? We can acquire knowledge about the drug culture, represented within the client population, because there may be various different drug cultures represented within our group setting. Stay informed. You know, when marijuana users started coming into treatment, and when people who were alcoholics but drank beer started coming into treatment with people who used opioids and crack cocaine, I remember seeing people put other people in a category. It's like, oh, you don't even need, what do you mean you got to have it? Beer? You know, or what do you mean you have marijuana? And so, you know, we want to acknowledge and inquire about the different drug cultures. Stay informed. Stay informed. Drug cultures can change rapidly and vary across racial and ethnic groups, geographic areas, socioeconomic levels, and generations. So we want to be informed. Being informed helps prevent infiltration of related behaviors and attitudes within the treatment environment. And I talked about that earlier, that we don't want the unhealthy drug culture behaviors infiltrating the treatment environment. And so counselors also need to help clients understand how such cultures support use or trigger and pose dynamics and relapse risk. So that being said, we want to educate the client, especially about triggers and urges, about the influence of drug cultures, and help them identify the specific behaviors, values, and attitudes that constitute their experience of using alcohol and other drugs. So here's a questionnaire that we can use to kind of help get an idea of the drug cultures that we may have, sub-drug cultures within a group in the treatment culture. Credibility. What does that mean to the client? That may mean something different to various members of the group. In the drug culture, you are familiar with how do you go about establishing credibility. So in their drug culture that they're familiar with, what was required of them to establish credibility? Socialization. We would ask, how were you introduced to the culture? How were you introduced to drugs? That always makes for an interesting conversation, whether it's group or individual. Some were introduced by family members. You know, some were introduced by parents. Some were introduced by chipping away. There's that word again. Chipping away at their parents' stash. And developing a habit. Friends in the community, peers. What values do you have? What values are upheld and devalued in the drug culture? Snitches get stitches, you know. So in the treatment setting, honesty is first and foremost. I remember learning early on in my recovery that honesty is the antidote to my disease thinking. And so that stuck with me, that being honest must be first and foremost, even if it means telling something about somebody that you don't want to tell on them, but it could save a life. And I, upholding that was a new value for me. That's a recovery value that I embraced and adapted to early on in my recovery, and then was quite tested in that area because my second oldest son was arrested for first-degree murder and charged with, at 15 years old, he was charged with murder. And the lawyer said if we lied about how they arrested him, we could get him out. And honesty had become a value that I so desperately held fast to because I didn't want to have disease thinking, because I didn't want to use, and I wouldn't lie about how my son was arrested to get him out. And I think it saved his life, because him being locked up kept him safe from the gang that wanted to kill him because he turned state's evidence. And so, and he didn't commit the murder. He was with someone who did, and so new values are embraced in the treatment culture, but we must first find out what are some of the values from the drug culture that are being upheld so that we can explore the validity and whether or not those values or beliefs are faulty. Status. In what ways can you obtain status or be seen as a success? So we want them to talk about what determines status, because if that's not addressed, they will go about trying to obtain status in the recovery environment and the treatment culture the same way they did in the drug culture. Rules. Are there spoken and unspoken rules or norms? And that kind of takes us back to values. Rules, spoken and unspoken, and then gender roles and relationships. What gender expectations exist around the drug use or the drug culture? So these are just some things that will help us to get a perspective on the culture of the clients that we're working with. Symbols and images. Are there symbols that represent a particular association with a group or a substance? Now, this proved to be very vital to the children incarcerated in a detention facility. And I talked about that earlier, in how that they had signs and they had symbols. Certain things they would throw up and would cause an outbreak and a fight. And we didn't know what it was. And so we didn't realize that they began to develop ways of dealing with this, so that they would assess them and not put opposite gang members together. So they, had a better idea of what they were dealing with, and they could watch over them in a better way. But without knowing the symbols and images, without talking about it, they wouldn't know. And without knowing, they couldn't address it. Attire. Are there specific ways to dress that show allegiance to a specific substance or group? View of past, present, and future. Are there specific beliefs about the past, present, and or future that, and that requires, of course, a great deal of diving into and some time in therapy to get to the root of some of the past, present, and future perspectives. And then language and communication. We want to ask, are there special verbal or nonverbal ways to communicate about substance-related activities? And then attitudes. What are common attitudes towards others, such as how they feel towards non-users, how they feel towards police, especially in this climate of police brutality that we're living in, towards parents or, other authority figures. So those are some things that we want to, some questions that we would like to ask. And I think we can take our last 10-minute break now. It's 2:22. See you, well, in Michigan, but it's 22 after the hour. So see you back here at 2:22 or 1:22, depending on whether you're Central Time or Eastern Time. And you don't have to sign out or anything. You'll just sign out at the end when we're done. So we'll come back and pick up with Module 4, Cultural Sensitivity versus Desensitization.